So as an old school gamer, I'm a massive fan of retro games, but let's be honest, it's not always the easiest to try to play some of the older games that we like. But over the past few years, there has been companies like Nintendo, Sega, and even Sony that came out with miniature versions of their previous consoles with preloaded games already on the consoles. But let's be honest, that doesn't have all the games that we're looking for. A lot of those games are all first party games, and in the case of the Sony PlayStation Classic, a lot of the ROMs don't even work properly because they uploaded the PAL versions and not the normal NTSC versions. Now there are definitely other options besides the classic mini systems in order to play retro games today. You have the Retron 5 as well as the analog consoles and the Polymega. But with all of these consoles, you have to already own the actual games. And not only that, when it comes to the analog consoles as well as the Polymega, you're going to be spending a lot of money. So I decided to go out and get a Raspberry Pi 4 with RetroPie installed, and today we're going to take a look at the Raspberry Pi 4 and see what it has to offer, and is this a good option for retro gamers today. Now you can pretty much use any type of gamepad as long as it's connected through USB. Sega and Retrobit licensed several retro type gaming controllers connected USB that work perfectly well with the Raspberry Pi 4. I'm going to be using this knockoff Super NES Super Famicom controller. So as you can see, I have the Retro Pi 4 uploaded, and there's a lot of different retro consoles to go through. We have Intellivision, Master System, Sega Genesis, N64, Nintendo, TurboGrafx CD, TurboGrafx 16, PlayStation. We have Sega 32X, Sega CD, Super Nintendo, the Vectrex. Like, this thing is like super old. Like, I remember having this when I was a kid. Odyssey 2, some arcade games, Atari 2600, Atari 7800, the Lynx, the ColecoVision, as well as Dreamcast, Game Gear, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and of course Game Boy Color. So we're gonna go ahead to the Super Nintendo and we're gonna look at some of the ROMs over on the Super NES. Memories. So now we're in the Game Boy Advance section, and we're going to play one of my favorite games, and that is none other than Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku 2. So I know what you guys are thinking. Obviously, the 8-bit and 16-bit games are going to work absolutely fine. But what about the more demanding games? What about the Dreamcast or the PlayStation or even the N64? One of the games, just so you guys can kind of get an idea of how it runs. And the PlayStation 1 games actually work really well. Like, they work really well, like no problem whatsoever. So pretty much every console that I have tested out on the Raspberry Pi 4 work absolutely perfect. I have not had an issue with any of them, with the exception of the N64. Apparently the N64 is just really hard to emulate, and there's a lot of slowdown and a lot of problems trying to play the N64 games on the Retro Pi 4. Now, some Nintendo 64 games definitely work better than others depending on how demanding the game is. Nintendo 64 is a really hard console to try to emulate, but if you're picking this thing up for all the other different stuff, whether it be the PlayStation, Dreamcast, NES, SNES, TurboGrafx, like all that stuff works absolutely great. But if you're picking this thing up to be a Nintendo 64 machine, it's not that. It's not going to be your go-to for anything Nintendo 64, unfortunately, because the emulation just isn't there yet. Nintendo is also having problems emulating their own games, and that just shows you how complicated the N64 emulator actually is. So overall, I think the Raspberry Pi is definitely worth the money, and it's the best option to play these retro games today, unless you want to spend anywhere between $700 to $800 to get an analog or a Poly Mega. And not only that, once you get those consoles, you also still have to own the actual games in order to play it. So Raspberry Pi 4, to me, I think is definitely worth the money. I've been playing with it a lot here on the channel, and I highly recommend it. If you're able to purchase one, you can get these things online. You can get them preloaded already with the RetroPie intact, and I definitely think it's worth the money if you are a retro game lover. So anyway, guys, that's my thoughts on the RetroPie 4. Be sure to leave your comments in the comment box below. Smash that like and subscribe button. Until next time, as always, I am Robert Storms, and that's my opinion.